What is up, YouTube? Thought of the day number 9. What percentage of heart rate max should you use for your zone 2? Is it 60 to 70%? Is it below 75%? Is it between 75 and 85%? It's a question that I got recently, and it's a very fair question because there is so many different iterations of this heart rate percentage for zone 2 that you can find online. And it's hard to make out which one is actually true. So maybe before I answer and give you my perspective on what percentage of heart rate max you should use for your zone 2, let's first remember what zone 2 is. And if you're not familiar with the concepts of zones or of thresholds, I actually translated my French course recently into English on understanding thresholds and training zones. So if that's something that you might be interested in, check the description of this video. But again, I'll give you the Coles notes here in this little thought of the day. So what is zone 2? What does it mean? So usually how it's defined is that it's going to be a training zone, so it's prescriptive. It allows you to prescribe training to elicit certain adaptations that we're looking for. And those adaptations are usually going to take place or are going to take place below first threshold. So first threshold could be measured via a lactate measurement, could be measured via ventilation. Those are currently the two accepted methods of finding threshold 1. You could look at a Moxie signal as well. But essentially zone 2 is going to be below that first threshold, okay? And so what this low intensity training does is that it has if you look at the autonomic side of things, it's parasympathetic in terms of its dominance. So there's a low fatigue cost associated with this kind of work. There's going to be development of more capillaries around type 1 fibers, more mitochondria, better oxidation of fats as a substrate. So you become more efficient from a metabolic standpoint, more healthy as well from a metabolic standpoint. You get better vasodilation while having low muscle tone in general, not too many contractions, compressing your vessels. And so that is going to, again, help with getting more blood to the tissues. It's going to help with eccentric cardiac hypertrophy, so getting your left ventricle bigger to push more blood out. And it's essentially going to have a positive effect at every level of the organism. And this low intensity training is fundamental to performance and health. But if we talk performance, especially in endurance sports, but also as a general means of training for any athlete on the planet. And when people ask me how many hours of zone 2 you should do per week, I usually say between 1 and 30, and the rest depends on your context and your sport and the time of the season, etc., etc. So what heart rate should we use to find that zone 2? And which one of the ones that I mentioned before is correct? Is it below 65% of heart rate max, below 70%, below 75%, below 80%, below 85%? And the tricky thing is that they could all be right. They could all be right because every single human is going to have a different heart rate at their first threshold, and that heart rate is the value that you want to stay under when performing your zone 2 training. So it's not actually a heart rate zone. It is a heart rate zone, but it's based on the underlying physiology and I guess the metabolic reactions and milieu that you're going to be eliciting with different intensities, more than it's just a heart rate zone based on a percentage of heart rate. So in my opinion, taking a percentage of heart rate is not a good way of finding your zone 2, because it could be spot on for you. You could also be 20 beats too high or 20 beats too low, or anything in between, right? And that's a huge margin of error. So for people that don't have any advanced measurements, I like to take a percentage of, which is still a percentage, so it's still an estimation, but in my estimation, it's better than a percentage of max heart rate, given its variability from individual to individual and from modality to modality, because we talk about heart rate zones, but then we don't necessarily talk about which modality that's in. And if you put someone on a bike and you actually do a physiological profile with them, and then you do the same physiological profile but on a treadmill running, your heart rate zones are going to be different for zone 2, right? Different body mass, different muscle mass that's being recruited, different body position relative to gravity, different types of contraction dynamics from a muscular standpoint. All those things are going to have an influence on heart rate. And so that's another important factor that is completely disregarded when we talk about percentage of max heart rate. So I like to take a percentage of critical power, which is fairly easy to obtain through a couple max effort tests. I like the 3 and 12 minute approach simply because it's the least number of tests that you can do and still get a decent value out of. And I like to take a fairly low percentage, like 57%, I believe, and below, for people that do very little to none low intensity training to begin with. 65% for anybody doing, say, 2 hours of low intensity training per week for at least 3 months. And then people doing much more than that, we could go up to 72% of critical power as the power or the speed that we're going to have at first threshold. And then the heart rate is going to be associated with that power or that speed. So that's one way I like to use it. The other way is through RPE, is trying to find a very low RPE, so 3 or 4 out of 10. And that's usually where I get people to start their zone 2 training. Because you can, if you base it on feeling, you can tell if you're in the right zone or not. If you do an hour ride on a bike, no tingling on the legs feel super light at the end. You could hold a conversation throughout the whole thing. No heart rate drift or cardiac drift, so the heart rate shouldn't be creeping up throughout the hour. It should stay nice and flat. Those are all signs that you're going to be in your zone 2 and that your training is going to be productive. You're not going to be accumulating fatigue because you're not passing the first threshold, keeping the internal state that you're looking for. So yeah, all heart rate zones are correct. All the different percentages are correct, but not for everybody and not for all modalities. So again, be careful if you use percentage of max heart rate for your zone 2, because it's far from being ideal and it's very prone to, I guess, mistakes simply because ideally you measure your physiology and from that you extract heart rate zones, not apply percentages of max heart rates based on an arbitrary chart that somebody put together to make it easy. So that's my perspective. What do you think? Leave me a comment below to tell me what your perspective is on those percentages of heart rates max and how to get to zone 2 and how you've determined your zone 2. That would be another interesting comment to have below. Leave me a like, subscribe to the channel because it's free and you can always change your mind, and I'll see you in the next video.